thank you so much for joining us for my talk tonight on love and duty, Confederate widows, and the emotional politics of loss. I am so excited to be here. I have heard such great things about this group, about your questions, um, and I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you. Tonight I will be talking about my first book. My name is Dr. Angela Elder. I teach at Converse University, which is a small college in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Um, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully, you can see the screen and the pictures that I have for us. Okay. So I know when I'm teaching and when I'm sitting in a lecture, I really like to have an idea of what is it that we are going to do. So I made us a roadmap for our time together. And what I plan to talk about is first, why this project. I know that I love hearing how historians and writers fall into the different projects that they study. So I'm going to tell you the story of how I got into my project. Second, why this argument, right? Very historian type question. What's the point? So what? Why is this significant? So I'll offer some ideas there. Then I'll talk about why this title. Again, this is something selfishly that I love hearing from writers, how they settle on the title of their book. And I think that this has an interesting story, so I will share about that. And then finally, a sneak peek of one of the chapters from this book. And I decided I was going to talk about the last chapter. This is actually the chapter that I didn't want to write. It came later in the process, but it ended up being one of my favorite chapters in the book. So we'll look at some sources that are in that chapter, some of the stories from that chapter, and then hopefully have plenty of time for any questions or comments that you have along the way. So I'll go ahead and get started. All right, why this project? So I fell into this project when I was in graduate school, and I was in Dr. John Insco's community studies class. And some of you are very familiar with John Insco and his work on community studies. I was a little intimidated. I was a first year master's student, and I knew I wanted to do something with the Civil War, but honestly, I had no idea what at that point. And so I went to the University of Georgia Library, into the archives, and just started pulling boxes, right? Letters, diaries, all of these records from the Civil War era, from the experience in Georgia, and was reading anything I could get my hands on, hoping something would stick so that I would have a topic for this paper for Dr. Insco. And one of the boxes held the story of Will and Rosa Deloney, who you can see Will here pictured on your screen. Um, Reading through the materials in the box, I discovered that I had walked past the location of their house that morning in downtown Athens. It's now a parking lot. I discovered that they had gotten married in the 1850s and discovered that when the Civil War began, they had three young children, and Will is going to enlist in the Confederacy. And then this quiet conversation begins, right? This conversation in paper and ink, which is a really powerful thing to get to hold those letters and read the stories that they are sharing with one another back and forth. And on their 9th wedding anniversary, the quote that I have on the screen, Will writes, from Virginia, miles from home, writes that he has a longing for home that makes my army life almost insupportable. And what Rosa didn't realize and what I didn't realize was that I was holding his very last letter. And so I flipped to the next page in the folder, and it's this smaller kind of light blue slip of paper that I also have on the screen for you, a telegram, and it says, among other things, on account of her condition, break the news to Miss Deloney as best you can. So it is a telegram that was sent to one of her neighbors because they knew that Rosa was pregnant, quite pregnant, and already quite on edge, wanting William to be home. It shared the news that he had been wounded and ultimately is going to die in prison or in a Union hospital, actually, not a prison, as a result of these wounds. And then there's Rosa, right? And so I'm sitting here 150 years later holding this piece of paper that changed an entire family and their trajectory. And I was struck by the fact that there was so much more information in the box, that there was so much more to the story. And so I kept reading. Rosa is going to give birth to that fourth child. It will be a girl. And then she will devote herself to trying to get her husband's body home. She wants him in Athens, Georgia, to have a place to mourn him, to be in the family plot. Um, and she knows that he was buried north of Washington, D.C. So fast forward a little bit, the war ends July of 1866. Rosa and Will's final child, that daughter, unfortunately dies of whooping cough. And a month later, Rosa is going to be successful in getting her husband's body returned home. And so I was struck by this, that if you go to the Oconee Cemetery today, you can see, Will's headstone, and then beside it, you will see a smaller headstone of his daughter, who he never met in life, but that are buried together in death. And there was just something about it that struck me, right? That's where this project started for me. And I had this question of what was life like for other widows, especially for widows of the Confederacy, who not only lose their husbands, but then also lose the war. Many of you are likely familiar with this number, 750,000, roughly the number of men who died in the American Civil War. We know that this is the nation's bloodiest war. We know that it is bloodier and has a higher casualty rate than the majority of the other wars the United States participated in combined. And it leaves widows at first by the hundreds, and then by the thousands, and then by the tens of thousands. And so some of them are very young. They get married in this patriotic rush to the altar. They're 16, 17, 18 years old. And as far as that number goes, we estimate that roughly 28% of soldiers were married. And so given that, we're looking at roughly 200,000 widows. And so death is something that weighs heavily on the Civil War people, especially on the Civil War South, as families are mourning a father, a brother, a son, a cousin. It almost seems to be something that is everywhere. One woman, Judith McGuire in Virginia, writes, "It is melancholy to see how many wear mourning." Or if you can see this newspaper on your screen, right? The center part reads, "The whole nation is a vast house of mourning. Christmas, once so merry and joyful, now finds the widow and her little one clustered together in grief. Carnage, blood, devilish hate, all the horrors of hell seem to rise uppermost and turn the land into a vast human slaughter pen." And so these are the stories that brought me into this project and made me want to take it a step further and do additional research to see what was the war like for widows, which leads us into part two, right? What ultimately does this book argue? And I have it straight from the text pulled up for you here, right? Love and Duty argues that the emotional expressions of widows carried political meaning amid the crisis of war and the battle to establish the Confederacy's legitimacy. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. I'm very fortunate to have a number of scholars to be able to build this work on. Folks like Drew Gilpin Faust, right? Diane Miller Somerville, Anya Jabor, Laura Edwards, Stephanie McCurry. Could go on, and I do go on in my footnotes, but fantastic scholars who help me to see the patterns in the research that I'm looking at. Backing up just a smidge, right? In the 19th century, before the Civil War even begins, there's a certain way that people mourned, a certain way that they expected death to come. And Drew Gilpin Faust especially talks beautifully about this idea of the good death, right? That someone is going to pass away at home, right? In their bed, at the end of a long life, surrounded by their families, surrounded by their loved ones. It's peaceful. There's an opportunity for them to share their last words. There's often a lot of religious elements in this experience. And as we know, the Civil War shatters the good death. I mean, a lot of death on a battlefield is nothing like the experience that they expected. And Whitman, right, shows us beautifully as he does what this is like. There they lie, strewing the fields and woods and valleys and battlefields of the South. The dead, the dead, the dead, our dead, the entire land saturated, perfumed with their impalpable ashes exhalation. So the good death is gone, right? Not much about the Civil War can be called a good death. And there's so much death that it seems as though much of the nation and much of the Confederacy is literally draped in black shadows, as you can see on this building here. Um, and because families cannot control how someone dies, they look to the things they could control. And in many cases, that is mourning, right? That etiquette that is there, the expectations, the prescription that is there is something that many families can cling to, and many widows in particular can cling to. And so this etiquette existed before the Civil War, and it's something that becomes even more important to many families, right? And so some of the things that would have been placed upon widows, that would have been expected of widows. Number one, widows are supposed to mourn for 2.5 years, 2.5 years of grief. And now, if we were in person together, I would pause right now and ask, how long does a widower, how long does a husband have to mourn if his wife dies? So you can think about that. How long do you think it is? And the answer is 3 months, right? So 3 months for a husband whose wife dies. For a widow, for a wife, she is supposed to mourn for 2.5 years as an acceptable grieving period. She is also supposed to look a particular way. She is supposed to dress in mourning, dress in black over the course of that 2.5 years, and then eventually progress into grays and lavenders. The idea being that their exterior should reflect their interior. And even if they couldn't afford mourning clothing, what I found is that many widows try to do this in any way that they can. So they're writing to their sisters and their relatives saying, where can I buy black dye? Or how can I, take essentially the only clothing that they do have or the only fabric that they do have and make it into mourning clothing if they can't afford to order it or have it made to get new fabric. So wearing black is something else that's an important part of this etiquette. They're also supposed to not remarry, right? For at least that 2.5 years. For that 2.5 years, they're supposed to be in mourning. A soldier is supposed to be something of value, irreplaceable. So no flirting, no dancing, no courting. Gone with the Wind. Many of you are familiar with Gone with the Wind, and Scarlett O'Hara would not have been a good widow by her society standards and the expectations at the time. A widow, according to the etiquette and the prescriptions placed upon her, she should care for her children. She should devote herself to her children, right? These are the children of her late husband. And again, especially because in the Civil War, so many of the deaths are at a younger age. We have a number of pregnant women, pregnant widows at the time of their husband's death. So that motherhood role becomes increasingly important. Religion also remains very important, that a widow should devote herself to God, to be religious, to find comfort in a reunion in heaven. And we see this a lot in the letters, even when their husbands are still alive. A lot of soldiers, right, at the bottom of their letters will write, "Meet me in heaven," and they will circle it. So that's something that's an important part of grief. And then finally, zooming in especially on the Confederacy, what I discovered as I was reading through speeches and newspapers and even letters from within the community is that for many, it became important that widows devoted themselves to the Confederacy. In other words, if a widow could lose her husband and still support the cause that killed him, that was a very powerful endorsement for the Confederacy. But if a widow said no, enough is enough, send home my father, send home my brothers, send home my male cousins. That was a powerful indictment. And so letters and newspapers and politicians all glorify this widow who mourns well, who says that the Confederacy is worth it, or that the cause is worth it, or that they wish that they were men so they could fight too. Um, and if a widow played that role, played that part, she in turn could get things that she wanted and she needed from her community. As I have up here, right on the slide, as soldiers' widows, Confederate women could leverage that label and their particular relationship within the Confederacy in attempts to receive support, recognition, and political influence. Likewise, government officials had the opportunity to use Confederate widows to further their own political agendas. Now, some of these widows will play the part perfectly, right? They will do exactly what their society expects them to do, what their community expects them to do. But some of them won't, right? So there's a huge diversity in mourning, a diversity in the experience of widowhood. Some women are too traumatized. Some women are too heartbroken. Some are angry. Some are incredibly impoverished, right? Some of them had rotten marriages, and so the loss of that husband maybe isn't as great of a sacrifice for some as it is for others. And so we'll unpack that a little bit more as we go along. But that essentially is our argument in a nutshell. Okay. Part three, why this title? Why did I ultimately settle upon Love and Duty? I originally had the book titled Married to the Confederacy, and they had these paired chapters, to have and to hold till death do us part, etc. But as I was writing and revising and working on this manuscript, the title didn't fit as well, in part because I added a chapter on Reconstruction, and it wasn't coming together as cleanly. So I needed a new title, and I agonized over this. Had a very hard time trying to figure out what I wanted to call it until I stumbled across this poem that's on your screen, "Heart Victories" by a soldier's wife. And as you can see, published or created and arranged by a woman in 1867. So pretty soon after the conclusion of the war. Um, and the whole thing is printed in the front of the book. I liked it so much. But if you can zoom in on that second stanza, it reads, "Their love, the true, the brave, the beautiful, the strong, wrestles with duty, gaunt and stern, wrestles and struggles long. He falls no more again his giant foe to meet, bleeding at every opening vein, love falls at duty's feet." So that was the image, right? So much of the book and the theme of this book is about love, and it's about emotion and how it's wrestling with duty, and it's wrestling with the needs of a new proposed government. Uh, and ultimately, right, in this poem, love is the one that falls, that duty must be the ultimate thing. And if you kind of go to the side of your screen, again, kind of in the middle, it says, "While she, the tried, the true, the loving wife of years, chokes down the rising agony, drives back the starting tears, I yield thee up," she cries, "in the country's cause to fight. Strike for our own, our children's home, and God defend the right." So again, right, our loving wife of years is the one who's putting aside her own agony in order to sacrifice her husband, which again does ring true for some of the experiences of the women that I study in my book, but it doesn't ring true for all of them. To give you a sense of the chapters here and how this unfolds, you can see I have a section kind of starting in the antebellum South, outlining what it was like to be a wife, to be a widow, what most women, white women, expected at the beginning of the Civil War, and then kind of progressing through how the war is affecting marriages, how the war is bringing about widows, what that experience is like initially in those early days of widowhood, and then progressing on as they start rebuilding their own lives and figuring out what was next for them. And so I want to zoom in now kind of on that sixth chapter. Beautiful tributes were paid to her, reconstructing a nation. And this is an important note for anyone who may be a graduate student out there or starting a new project or starting a new book. When I started this project and I started all of my research, I imagined it as a Civil War project, right? So everything I did when I went to all of these archives all across the South, I took pictures of documents and I ended in 1865, which I shouldn't have done. I wish I had gone forward and taken even more because then when it came to writing the book, I wanted more of that story. What happens, right? And so I went back, especially in newspapers, and got part of that story, which is the start of chapter 6. There's a lot more work to be done, which is really exciting. Um, and so when I began, right, these were the kinds of things that fascinated me that ended up in my notebooks and in my files. 16-year-old Esther, you can see here, from Charleston, South Carolina. She writes, quote, "One looks at a man so differently when you think he may be killed tomorrow. Men whom up to this time I thought dull and commonplace seemed charming." So a lot of the book is stories like this, right? How does the war affect young women? How does it bring them to the altar? What is it like for women like Hetty Carey, who are married for 3 weeks and then are widowed and find themselves in the same church, surrounded by the same people that they got married in 3 weeks earlier? In Hetty's case, she's going to be a widow for about 15 years. But then as kind of the process went along, I became more and more interested in questions like, did widows support the lost cause? What role did they play in Reconstruction? What role did widows who lost husbands during the war play in things like the Ladies Memorial Association or eventually the United Daughters of the Confederacy? So I had to do some additional research to begin to get at these questions. And I'm going to give you a series of quotes here, pulled from the book in that last chapter, to start to answer some of these questions. So here you see a quote. It was published in a newspaper that says, "What evidence have we that the cause has died out?" And so this is in 1867. "But when we see widows wail or hear an orphan cry, I feel the cause has indeed died out. If you let one of them wail, you might as well say the cause is dead. It shall be your cost." And so newspapers across the country pick up this speech and publish it. And it's published under the title, "Relief for the Widows of Confederates. They declare the cause of the South is not lost." And then it continues to go on to discuss what's happening in the former Confederacy, particularly with eulogies and with the construction of monuments. So here you see another quote. "Leave the noble memorials you have begun, which are only vanity. The Confederate dead all sleep well, thank God." Instead, he calls for support for Confederate widows. This, he believed, is what deceased soldiers would have wanted above all else, right? We must provide an asylum for both widows and orphans. He's arguing for the construction of a home. And so this chapter centers on this question. Did people agree with him or not? What role did widows play in reconstructing the nation or not? And what I found, at least in my preliminary research, is that there are some elite widows, and I'll tell you the story of one in just a few minutes. There are some elite widows who take on this charge, who are propping up the lost cause, who are involved in the Ladies Memorial Association. But the majority of widows that I've encountered did not. In fact, many of them almost seem to say, "I have already sacrificed to this war. I don't have anything else to give." Instead, their reconstruction project is more centered on reconstructing their own lives and making ends meet. So, some evidence here to support that. All right, so this is from another newspaper. This one was in Georgia, but it's reporting on something that's happening in Alabama. And as you can see here, it says, "These women are widows of the Confederate soldiers who perished in battle or died from diseases in camp. We hope the citizens of Montgomery will not disregard a cry of distress so full of agony, literally the wail of the widow and the orphan. And essentially, what's going on in this article is that there's a group of women in Alabama who can't get work. They can't get jobs. And so they're appealing to the fact that they are widows of the Confederacy. And because they are widows of the Confederacy, they feel as though they are owed something. They are owed support because of their sacrifice. One thing to note, the word orphan, it's a little bit different than how we think of it today. Today, right, when we think of orphan, we think of someone who has lost both of their parents. But at this time, in the 19th century Civil War era, it is also used to define someone who has lost their father. So all children who still had their mother, who was a widow, living and with them, would get this distinction of orphan. So when Lincoln, right, talks about the widow and the orphan, yes, it's about the biblical context of that, but it's also about the children of soldiers, again, who are not necessarily without a mother. Okay. Some more quotes to kind of see if any patterns emerge. In North Carolina, here you have someone in Virginia suggesting that, quote, marble monuments to the Confederate dead will not feed starving Confederate widows and orphans. So another call for direct support for widows, not for monuments. Here in South Carolina, talking about another monument that's being constructed, better than a costly monument, better than a starry pointing pyramid is the home. And again, this was a home being constructed to support impoverished widows. And then in Virginia, we trust that the work of decorating and honoring the graves of the dead will go on, but the noblest tribute we can pay the memory of a dead soldier is to take care of those desolate loved ones. Let us not commit the melancholy error of expending all our sympathies upon those whose quiet slumbers no earthly honors can disturb. So, over and over again, we are seeing this call for support, right? This idea that Confederate widows gave something and they need help, right? That they need some assistance from their communities. Perhaps most bluntly, as you can see here, the dead can wait. They rest quietly in the cold grave. That grave will become no colder. And so I found this fascinating, this idea that the cause, if you're looking at the cause, if you're looking about where money should be spent, that there is this argument that many people are making that it should be not towards monuments, but towards supporting widows. I'm going to get to that in a second. Right, that for many of those who are living through this time period, the struggles that they encounter are of the daily nature, right? That they're trying to have enough to eat. And that chapter also has a lot of stories that are hard to read. So there's one about a widow. Again, this is published in a newspaper. She's out working and her two children are swimming, and both of them pass away, that they drowned. And it's about how the community is struck by someone who has encountered so much tragedy. And for many of the widows who are writing and reflecting at this moment, their concerns are not necessarily with the lost cause or these other projects that are happening, but it is of that daily nature. Of course, though, with everything, there are exceptions. So I'm going to share now one story of a widow who does champion the cause, who does play a huge role, reminding us that widows are not, right, a monolith, that there is a lot of diversity in mourning. And this is, as you can see pictured here, Emily Todd Helm. So some of you might be familiar with her. It's a fascinating story. She's married to Benjamin Hardin Helm, who fights for the Confederacy. She also is a part of the Todd family. So her older sister, Mary Ann Todd, is the first lady, right? Lincoln's wife in the White House. And so when Lincoln talks about this being a war of brother versus brother, he literally is thinking about his in-laws. Roughly half of the Todds support the Confederacy, half of the Todds are going to support the Union. Emily is one who falls on the Confederate side of that equation. Also quite young, also has a number of young children, 3, I think, and has money and position. So she is someone who travels with her husband, right? Some elite women, some elite wives, we're able to do this and wanted to do this. So Emily is actually in Georgia when her husband is killed in battle. She decides that she wants to go home to mourn. She wants to get back to Kentucky. But of course, the problem with Kentucky is that Kentucky is still part of the Union. And so, as she is trying to cross all of the lines to get back to the state, she gets stopped. And they essentially say you can pass as long as you swear the oath of loyalty. And Emily, as a new widow, a grieving widow with her young children, says no. She says absolutely not, right? Her husband just died fighting for the Confederacy. She is not willing to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. But she's a celebrity. All the Todds are celebrities, right? They're all the in-laws of Abraham Lincoln. And so they send a telegram to the White House, says, "What do you want me to do about this?" essentially. And Lincoln responds, "Send her to me." And so we get this odd situation. We're in the middle of a civil war. You have a Confederate widow in the White House. And remember, the Lincolns at this time, they are also grieving, not just the losses around the nation, but the loss of their own son with Willie's death. And so Emily reflects on this, right? At first, she says they are all too grief stricken for speech. They could only embrace each other in silence and tears. Sister and I cannot open our hearts to each other as freely as we would like. This frightful war comes between us like a barrier of granite closing our lips. Emily is a beloved little sister, as best we can tell from the records, at least before the Civil War. When she first met Abraham Lincoln, she describes being a child and she sees Lincoln walk in and she thought that he reminded her of a giant, right, from Jack and the Beanstalk. And that he would say, "Fee, fi, fo, fum." And she talks about hiding in her mother's skirts until Lincoln swoops in and picks her up and says, "So this is little sister." And he will call her little sister for the rest of her life. And so they're grieving, they are family, but at the end of the day, she is a Confederate widow, which we can see reflected here. Um, Again, a story, this one related by Emily's daughter, in which you see someone who is not as willing to kind of put aside politics in order to focus on family, and is engaging in this conversation with Emily and says, "Well, we whipped the rebels at Chattanooga. I hear, madam, that the scoundrels ran like scared rabbits." She responds, "It was an example, Senator Harris, that you set them at Bull Run," right? The Todd tongue is infamous. It is sharp, it is witty, it is biting, runs through the entire family, including with Emily. "If I had 20 sons, they should all be fighting the rebels." And of course, Emily responds, "If I had 20 sons, Senator Harris, they should all be opposing yours." Um, Lincoln is going to get some criticism for having her in the White House. He is going to be up for a reelection. Ultimately, she is going to leave, going to return back to her mother, return back to Kentucky. But notably, she never has to swear that oath of loyalty. She does avoid that. And so I give her as an example. This is someone who the Confederacy and then the former Confederacy adored and loved. They invited Emily to speak at veterans reunions. They put her picture on their badges at one point. She is going to travel all across the South. She's going to get positions as a postmistress. She is going to give speeches and write letters to the men who fought with her husband, and they adore her for it. She almost becomes a kind of celebrity as a widow and will live as the widow of Benjamin Hardin Helm for the rest of her life. And so, big picture, you have likely seen this picture before if you've done a lot with Civil War studies. Zoom in on the corner and notice the two women dressed in black. I think there's obviously a lot to gain from studying and reading these stories of widowhood, right? Analyzing, and I say this in the book, analyzing the experiences of white Confederate widows changes the way that we think about the Civil War and especially the Civil War household. Though they shared a gender, women did not wound the same, work the same, nor share the same strengths and weaknesses. And as these relationships are put under stress, it becomes even more apparent. I have a huge section in the book that talks all about widows and their mothers-in-law. And so that's something I can talk more about if y'all have questions about it. It's a fascinating thing to zoom in on and see the varieties of way that war affected widows. I would also argue that emotions matter, right? That for Confederate widows, the personal is political and the political is personal. And that leaves a lasting impact on Confederate officials and on Confederate communities. And so we see widows who are glorified and who are held up as the ideal. And then we also see criticisms of widows who do not. Stories of women who mourn too much. There's one woman who, upon discovering she is a widow, it will literally fall to the ground at her husband's grave and refuse to wait for the soldiers to disinter him, is going to dig him up with her bare hands because she has to have that proof. She has to see his face, and this is a scarring experience for the nurse who is writing about it. There are also widows who remarry way too quickly. There's one woman in Georgia who travels across the state with gold around her waist and eventually is going to remarry in the middle of her mourning period to her late husband's business partner. And so she's receiving all these condolence letters, people who are saying, they're so sorry about her loss, not realizing that she is already remarried, even though she had the wealth that it was not necessary for her to do so. So lots more stories that I can share with y'all along that side. But I want us to kind of wrap up the me talking portion of this with this dedication from Jefferson Davis's Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. And I think that it is striking that when he writes this history, right, this story of the Confederate government after the Civil War, he doesn't dedicate it to the veterans who fought. And he doesn't dedicate it to the soldiers who died. Instead, he dedicates it to the women of the Confederacy, especially those, if you can just kind of scan down, who express their enduring grief, love, and reverence for our sacred dead. And I think that's something that is worth noting. So, as we wrap up, if you are interested in the book, it is available everywhere. It's available on Amazon and other places that you can purchase your books. It is also available through UNC Press, and as of the time of this, they are offering this code for a lot of their books, where you can get 30% off this book and other books. And I also wanted to say just thank you. I know this is a busy time and there's a lot of ways that you can spend your time, and I'm excited that you are listening and thinking about these things. I'm excited to answer some questions as you have them. If we don't get to your question, or if you would rather ask it one-on-one later, my email address is on this slide, angela.elder@converse.edu. I do have Twitter. I'm rarely on Twitter, but I wanted to give you that as well. And so thank you. And I look forward to our conversation.